Okay. Welcome, friends, to the Puffin Cultural Forum and what is the first of what will be an ongoing monthly series of interviews with noted writers. I should mention by way of my own introduction, I am a professor of human rights teaching at Columbia University and Hunter College. And for many years, I've also been a professional leader in the Society for Ethical Culture and in years past have conducted many of these interviews, but now we're going to do them on a regular monthly basis on the first Sunday of every month at 4 o'clock. And this is our very first interview of our new series. And I should say, I am very pleased and privileged that our first guest is Mr. Eyal Press, and we'll be discussing his very new book entitled Dirty Work. Here it is, subtitled Essential Jobs and the Hidden Toll of Inequality in America. By way of introduction, let me say that Mr. Eyal Press is an award-winning author and journalist. In addition to having written, I believe, 2 books, he's contributed to The New Yorker, The New York Times, among many other publications. And I'm happy to say that he is also a recipient of a Puffin Foundation Fellowship, which helped enable him to write Dirty Work, which we'll be discussing in a moment. So, Eyal Press, welcome to the Puffin Cultural Forum. And
Thank you.
Congratulations on being our first guest, I should say.
Thank you so much. And I'm really honored that I'm the first in what sounds like a great series of conversations. And this one has special meaning for me because, as you mentioned, the Puffin Foundation has been incredibly supportive of my work and enabled me to write this book. So I'm really looking forward to talking about it.
Right. I'm so glad Puffin could bring you to us this afternoon. Okay, let's get underway with Dirty Work. It was, I'm sure, a difficult and arduous book to research, and I have to congratulate you on what is really an extraordinary piece of work. Let me start off just very basically asking you what the thesis is of Dirty Work and what inspired you to write it.
Yes. So I think the best way to explain the thesis is to begin by explaining what I mean by dirty work, because I don't mean the colloquial expression. I think when people hear the phrase, they often think of something, an unpleasant job that is physically dirty, like collecting the garbage on the street. My definition is different. Dirty work in my book refers to morally troubling activity that society depends on and tacitly condones, but generally doesn't want to hear too much about. We'll go into some examples of what I mean by that, but the idea derives from a sociologist named Everett Hughes. And Hughes, actually more than 50 years ago, wrote this incredibly interesting essay that is the sort of point of departure for my book. And it was titled Good People and Dirty Work. And he based this essay on a semester he spent teaching abroad in post-war Germany. He was in Frankfurt, and this was right after World War II. And Hughes spent a lot of his time when he wasn't teaching talking to the folks in Germany he'd known before the war. And these were cosmopolitan intellectuals and professionals, and what he refers to in the title as the good people. These were not supporters outwardly of the Nazi party. And yet when he brought up what happened during the war and what the Nazis did, he was struck by the contradictory, sort of troublingly ambivalent response he would get from these folks he knew. On the one hand, they would say to him, anytime you bring up what the Nazis did, it brings us shame. I'm ashamed for my people, as one architect he quotes says. And that's what you'd expect someone who wasn't, a supporter of the Nazis to say. But then later on, the same person would say, but the Jews, they really were a problem. And something had to be done to settle this problem. And, Hughes is understandably taken aback and struck by this, that on the one hand, there's shame about this. On the other hand, there's a kind of definition of Jews and other groups as outside of the community of the good people, of the Germans. And so he writes this essay, Good People and Dirty Work, in which he posits that this dynamic forces us to think about the fact that in Nazi Germany, and as he takes pain to stress, in all societies, there are these unethical things that go on with the tacit consent, or he called it an unconscious mandate from the good people in society. It's not that the good people support what's being done, it's that they don't really want to hear about it, because at some level they agree enough that this is a problem that someone else should handle. And to me, the most interesting thing about that theory is that it applies much better to our society, to a democratic society like the United States, than it does to Nazi Germany. Because in the Nazi case, and indeed in any authoritarian country you can think of, say North Korea today, it really doesn't matter too much what the good people think. The regime is going to do what the regime is going to do, and short of, it's just there isn't that much that the input of ordinary people can do to change that. But in a democratic society like ours, the dirty work that goes on is amenable to change. It is subject to really the collective wishes of society. It is shaped by what we allow to be done in our name. And Hughes, in fact, as I quote in the book, said very explicitly, my essay was directed at North Americans. We have so much racial violence in this country. We have police lynchings. He really said all of this in the 60s, but it applies actually today. And we allow this to go on without questioning it. And so I took that as the point of departure to say, okay, what kind of dirty work happens today in the United States, and what kind of mandate do we give it?
Very good. Well, in some ways, your remark that it is subject to change sort of prefaces a question that I want to get to at the end, and that is it really subject to change, and to what extent, and if so, how? Which, to my mind, is the very difficult question that we need to entertain. But before we get there, it seems to me another pivotal concept, unifying concept in your work is the idea of moral injury, and you do define it. And it seems to me, as I read the book and infer from it, that there are at least three strata of moral injury. There's moral injury suffered by the people whom you primarily document, who are involved in this unseen dirty work. There are the people, and in one case, since you deal with slaughterhouses, non-human sentient beings that are the object of the work that your protagonists engage in, that suffer their own injury as being really on the victim end, of the most victimized end of the hierarchy. And then we might argue there is moral injury done to us, to society as a whole, and so forth. And I'm wondering if you can unpack the notion of moral injury and how it relates to those three tiers of persons, or in one case animals, and so forth. And then we'll get into the specific scenarios that you develop. Okay.
Sure. So yeah, as you say, moral injury is definitely a central concept in the book. And you've really, I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but you're right. There are these different layers of it. I think it's really important just to stress from the outset that in the dirty work I look at, there are two sets of victims, and maybe three from what you just said. This work is morally troubling because I say, and I suggest and document, it harms innocent people often. It harms other human beings, or it harms the natural environment and non-human animals, in the case of slaughterhouses, which is amply documented in the book. But it also is injurious or harmful at a second level to the people who do it, I'm contending.
Right. Yes.
By way of putting them in situations effectively as the functionaries who carry out tasks like manning the kill floors in industrial slaughterhouses or running the mental health wards in jails and prisons. That doing this kind of work, I suggest, can be, isn't in all cases, but can be highly injurious to the people who do it, to the people who in effect dirty their hands, right, in this. And then at a third level, which I don't spell out, but which is implicit, and I think your question gets at that, we are injured collectively as a society. You know, how so? Because we end up perpetuating collectively harms that are repeated time and time again, that don't get addressed. We can, again, we'll talk in specific cases, but if you think about jails and prisons as de facto mental health asylums, we'll talk about how I think there are really no winners in that scenario. There are just a lot of people who are put in harm's way and who are injured. And as a society, I think what collectively happens is that it's that our own integrity, our moral integrity, our collective sort of moral standing is lowered. Because even when we don't see this dirty work and secrecy and the lack of, you know, the fact that it happens in the shadows is very central to the cases I look at. Right. But even so, it is happening. And so it is part of what we have to reckon with when we think about how we judge and think about our society.
Yeah, very good. Okay, the three major scenarios that you deal with, as you've mentioned, are people who are mentally ill in prisons. The second are drone warriors who sit at a joystick and kill people 10,000 miles away through drones. And the third are slaughterhouses. And then you do include a few other scenarios, not quite as exhaustively, in terms of the Deepwater Horizon catastrophe. And then you have a very interesting chapter, and I want to, query you on that in terms of high-tech dirty warriors and why you included that very privileged class of people and what role they play in your book. Let's talk about the specifics. We've been talking about concepts. Let's move into the specific scenarios. And I think you deal with these very well by, in effect, interviewing and highlighting individual people who are caught in this dirty work and really follow them over a period of time, both while they're in the work and then beyond it, and the effect that it has on them, and what they have been what they've witnessed, and what in effect they are coerced to do, given their not only economic status but their work situation. Why don't we start with the prison in Florida? And you're absolutely correct that prisons have become our de facto warehouses for the mentally ill. To a great extent, and you so graphically and painfully describe that. Why don't you tell us about that scenario, and then we'll move through them.
Sure. So my book begins with the story of Harriet Kryskovsky, and Harriet got a job as a mental health aide working at this prison, the Dade Correctional Institution in Florida. And her job was in the mental health ward of the prison. She got there, I have to say, when she started working there, it was not her dream job, to put it mildly. She simply, it was post-recession, after 2008, the financial recession and the financial crash. Harriet applied to work in a number of different jobs, and this is where she ends up getting hired. And it's not long after she begins working there that she starts feeling morally troubled by her role, because she sees that the patients she's entrusted to bring out to the rec yard to get some fresh air are not being allowed out, right? That they're being held in solitary confinement. Many of them are deteriorating instead of stabilizing, which is the putative purpose of this mental health ward. It's called the Transitional Care Unit. It's supposed to stabilize people. She's not seeing that. And she's seeing a lot of verbal and physical abuse. When she reports what she's seeing to her supervisor, she very quickly gets the message, both from her supervisor, actually, who tells her that, our job is to get along with security, and from the security guards themselves, that she shouldn't say anything about this, that her role effectively is to go along with what the guards who run the place do. And how she is sent this message very directly is she's walking around and she suddenly is left alone. The guards disappear from the rec yard when she's there. The guards disappear from the group sessions she's running. And she depends on these guards for her own safety, just to do the work she's doing. And so she's very quickly sent this message: don't step out of line, don't report things you think are wrong. That's not your job. As I say in the book, this is actually a very common experience for mental health aides who work in jails and prisons. In one survey that I cite, 1/3 of those who worked said that they experienced ethical conflicts like the one that Harriet went through. They saw abuse, they saw mistreatment, they didn't think it was right, but they also didn't think they could say anything. And in Harriet's case, it takes really graphic and awful form, this what ends up happening, because she comes to work one day and she hears about a prisoner named Darren Rainey. And Rainey was schizophrenic. He was in the TCU on a drug charge, brought to Dade for that. And she hears that Rainey collapsed in a shower from the heat of the water. And at first she says, she thinks, well, he must have slipped, or did he have a heart attack or something? The nurses tell her, oh no, he was locked in there deliberately. And the guards who locked him in there controlled the water temperature and simply didn't turn it down or turn the water off. And in effect, Rainey, who ends up falling in this shower, is tortured and dies a gruesome death. He suffers burns on much of his body. Harriet learns this. The other members of the mental health staff learn it. None of them report it. It is not reported by any of the professional mental health staff. And the reason it's not reported is what I just said, that they felt beholden. As Harriet said to me, I thought somebody had to report it, but I didn't want to do it myself. I didn't want to lose my job. I didn't want to, risk that. On one level, that failure to say something, to stand up in that moment, I think anyone who hears that and reads the story of Rainey and reads about what was happening in this prison has an impulse to judge it. What do you mean you didn't want to lose your job? This was a human rights abuse. This was not a matter of just a judgment call on what an incarcerated person was going through. This was torture. This was murder. On the other hand, I think we have to ask ourselves, what really do we expect when we have turned jails and prisons into de facto mental health asylums, criminalized mental illness, particularly for the poor, and then put people whose jobs place them in these difficult situations in charge? And what I suggest in the book, and it's really a theme of the book, is that people like Harriet end up doing the dirty work, and effectively suffering the moral injury for a set of decisions that were made beforehand that shouldn't have been made, right? The policy decisions that led us to that point. So anyway, that's the first story in the book. The second section of the prison section of the book is actually about the guards, which we can talk about.
Well, I want to get to this. I want to deal with the prison situation first, because
Sure.
In some ways that seems to be, in some ways, the most sociologically, politically, and maybe even morally the most onerous. I think you do talk about this, and I think that the situation again is many layered. I think it's important to, as you do, discuss the economic background and capacity of people who take these jobs. They're coerced by their economic circumstance. They suffer from their own personal dislocations and problems in life. So they're not coming to these jobs out of a position of great psychological capacity, a strong sense of self. They don't have great support systems themselves. And it seems to me they're put into what I would argue, if I were in Harriet's position in that prison, an impossible situation. And I'm wondering if you can talk about, from a sociological and political point of view, an economic point of view, who indeed is invested in this work that seems to make it all the more onerous from a psychological point of view, and maybe even enhances the moral injury that someone like Harriet suffers from.
Well, so central to my book, the book is about work and this particular sort of form of it, but it's also fundamentally about inequality.
Mhm.
Um, and in each of the sections, I go into the sociological background of the people who wind up working in jails and prisons and working in places like the Dade Correctional Institution in the mental health ward. Um, you're very right. Harriet and most of the people I interviewed who worked there in the mental health ward, these were not elite members of the psychiatric profession, right? These were folks who were doing, in effect, a job of last resort, a job that they needed to pay the bills and relied on. And in several different cases, I interviewed people who told me, look, I wanted to quit. But I couldn't afford to at the time. Interestingly enough, the one person on the mental health staff who did get fired and did say something, a guy named George Malincrot, and he did so actually before the Rainey incident. He like the others, he was aware that this abuse was going on, and he witnessed one particularly brutal incident that he heard reported to him. He ends up getting fired for his outspokenness. He was the principled upstander in this unit, right? He was also a bachelor who came from a more well-to-do background and who had some, he did suffer financially. And when I met him, he was, there were some financial concerns he had, but it was also clear from talking to him that that he had some cushion to fall back on. And I have no doubt that if the elite members of the psychiatric profession were working and were sent to work in places like Dade, in places like Rikers, in places like a Georgia prison I recently wrote about in the New Yorker, where again I heard and saw testimonials suggesting abuse in really graphic forms. If it were a job that was randomly distributed within the profession, I think we'd have a lot more outrage. I think we'd have a lot more, we'd have statements, maybe collective statements from the profession about the fact that this is an untenable situation that we have to address. But it's not. And that inequality helps keep this both hidden and out of the way and not talked about in the way that I think it otherwise would be.
Well, economic class is so essential, I think, to your analysis and your work here. I suspect most psychologists and psychiatrists would rather work on the Upper East Side of Manhattan than in Dade Prison in Florida. Am I right about that?
I think you're right about that. I think you're right about that. Yes.
Right. Now, you do have a few paragraphs on the particular double burden of African Americans who work in the prison, because many of the inmates who suffer from mental disabilities are Black. They take these jobs because it's perhaps the only job they can find, or it's the best job they can find, and so on. I'm talking about guards in the prison. Can you describe the mental and psychological burden that African Americans working in a place like Dade endure?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right that Dade is located south of for about 40 miles south of Miami, in a very poor community, Homestead, and I visited and spent some time there. The only job sign I saw advertising jobs while I was there was at the prison. It was a big billboard, and that tells you something about the lack of opportunity in the community. And as I learned, and as is true nationally, actually, but particularly at Dade, much of the staff were female people of color, and took these jobs because they needed the work and they needed a way to make a living. And there's, I think, a particularly cruel irony to the fact that jobs working in the prison system have become more diversified. There was a time when structural racism meant that in places like Florida, all of the guards and all of the law enforcement positions were reserved for white people. This changed in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But of course, the 70s, 80s, and 90s are also the time when we have mass incarceration. And we have, we're building these, the largest prison system in the world. And so I raise the question of, this double burden you mentioned, that, to what extent is this really an opportunity for people for people of color to be working in facilities and institutions that disproportionately harm communities of color in this country? And that is certainly true in the example of Dade. It's true in Rikers, by the way. I think something of the order of 90% of the security staff at Rikers is Black or Hispanic. So anyway, I think that though when we talk about prison guards, and actually when we talk about dirty work generally, I'm not telling readers not to be critical of what they, in some instances, do in these facilities. The description of what happened at Dade makes it very clear that there was abuse going on, and that the guards who were responsible for that abuse should be held accountable for it. This is not in any way an effort to say they are innocent, but it is an effort to complicate the story by suggesting that the guards, like all dirty workers, are agents of a society that puts them in these positions and that puts certain people into these positions. And again, it is not society's elites. It is not society's privileged. And that, is deeply troubling.
I think that's your overall and fundamental analysis that really is the scaffolding on which you are building these scenarios and the reality of dirty work. Let's move on to the second scenario, and that is drone warriors, who obviously work in an environment very different from Harriet and others who work in the prison with the mentally disabled. Tell us a little bit about that phenomenon and the type of what they do and the moral injury that drone warriors suffer from.
Sure. So I think when drone warfare began, and after 9/11 people started reading and hearing about these unmanned aerial vehicles and these this distance killing, the strikes from, that would be through computer screens. I think the popular image was that this would be war as a video game. In effect, a sort of form of as some have put it, joystick warriors, instead of real soldiers who on the ground directly experience both the threat from others, but also the gravity of what's going on. There was, I think, a widespread perception that drones were going to remove all of that and in effect turn warfare into something very simple, which is just pressing a button on a screen, right? And then you see something blow up and that's it, and you go home and you don't think about it. Well, I think the not thinking about it is very true for society. In other words, drones very effectively turned the endless wars we've been fighting since 9/11 and are still fighting, turned them into background noise, took the whole, so many of the objections that came about during the Iraq War were to the costs of the war in terms of blood and treasure for our side. And drones eliminate that, right? And they seem to, make war a costless exercise in many ways. So I think for society, they have very effectively removed the wars from the picture, and certainly for Congress as well. There's very little oversight that goes on. But what's not true is that the people who are actually in the drone program are just pressing buttons and going home and not thinking about it. And this was in some ways the most surprising area of the book in terms of the research I did, because it's unusual that there's such a high burnout rate in this program. If it's just like playing a video game, why would that be? right? And yet the studies that the military itself has done of people who are in the kill chain in these drone, operations suggest levels of stress and levels of burnout and levels of exposure to graphic violence that are as intense or more intense than for soldiers on the ground. And I don't want to, in any way equate the two forms of stress, because I think that, again, we're talking about people who don't actually set foot on the battlefield. And so they're not exposed to things like, IUD blasts that cause PTSD, that cause the brain injuries that are associated with post-traumatic stress disorder. But on the other hand, they're burning out at incredibly high rates, right? And there are suicides, and there are people quitting the program. And so what if it's not the direct exposure to combat that is causing that? What is happening? And what I suggest is happening is a form of moral injury, a form of discomfort with the role of this, being in the kill chain in these distant, in these targeted assassinations.
Right. I think maybe the most graphic illustration in your book, and there are many that are very graphic and difficult to absorb, is the case of the drone warrior who kills a target, and the victim's son is standing in the vicinity, and after the kill tries to reassemble his father's body parts, which is just searingly painful to think about.
So that scenario was actually described to me by someone in the drone program, and it's in the book, and as are the other specific cases I talk about, because I want to give readers, I want to dispel and challenge this notion that this does nothing to the person, who's just watching the screen all day. And there are other examples in the book that are call attention to this. But if we just think back a couple of weeks to what was in the news, when we pulled out of Afghanistan, there was a drone strike that took place, and it ends up hitting the wrong target, and upwards of 10 civilians are killed in this strike. And what was so striking to me about it is that we finally had a conversation nationally. It was in the papers. It was even on the nightly news. I saw it being discussed. And it was striking to me. And actually, I got some notes from some of the people that I'd interviewed in the book saying, finally they're talking. Because so many of those strikes don't make the news, and nobody sees them. And the people who do see it are the people in the drone program. And so it was striking to me to just see this happen and get this kind of blip of attention, when Afghanistan was in the news. And yet now, once again, we've moved on. Society has decided, that's last week's news. And although things have changed in Afghanistan, the rules of engagement for drone strikes in many other countries are still up for grabs, and we're still carrying out strikes. So, it's a striking example, I think, of how dirty work can be hidden from view, can be sort of pushed to the shadows.
Right. You don't cover it. It's just a footnote, but a thought that went through my mind would be, it would be interesting, I think, to compare the reactions of drone warriors with pilots in warfare. I mean, when aerial bombardment started in the First World War, and then, of course, intensified by many magnitudes in the Second World War, there was some question about the reaction of pilots for whom their victims were anonymous. It's different to drop a bomb on a city and kill people who you never see from, in effect, actually confronting your enemy face to face on the battlefield. And there was discussion about the reactions. And it might be interesting to compare how aerial bombardment and the psychology of bombardiers relates to drone warriors, and whether there's some similarity.
Absolutely. I think it's a very valid point. The one thing I would say, though, is that what comes across in the drone program is, on the one hand, the distance, on the other hand, the intimacy, right? So people in the drone program are seeing and watching footage of targets. And some of that footage, as you alluded to earlier, can be extremely intimate and graphic. So on the one hand, it's exactly the scenario you've described, where you're distant from it, and that may create a sense of, I can carry out this action without feeling the gravity of it in the same way. On the other hand, there's this really eerie intimacy that's created. And I think another layer of the moral question that comes into it is that, unlike conventional soldiers, people in the drone program who are in the kill chain, they are not making these decisions under fire themselves, right? There's a quote, and I quote it in my book. It's attributed to Camus. Who knows if Camus actually said it? But I quote a commander who wrote a book, who quotes Camus saying, that in effect, the only justification for killing is if you're going to be killed, right? That the gun is pointing at you. It's kill or be killed. I think that scenario is, for a lot of soldiers, what can make the aftermath of a lethal encounter explainable, both to themselves, to their fellow, soldiers, just that you can live with this idea because you tell a story in which your own life or your comrade's life was under threat. For the people in the drone program, they are not under threat in the same way, and yet they are making decisions that have life or death consequences for others. And just to end that point, it's us as a society that has decided this is how we want it, right? We don't want the same levels of casualties in these wars. We don't want the ground invasion. We don't want the risks, and that, in many ways that's understandable. Who wants their own soldiers put in harm's way? But what we've effectively done then is put people in the kill chain in this kind of morally gray area, where they are making these decisions and then they have to live with it. And then they go back to society, a society that has kind of forgotten we've even fight these wars.
Right. Okay, I want to move on to the third set of workers whom you talk about. And those are those who work in slaughterhouses, slaughtering and dismembering animals of all different types, from chickens to cows and so on. And I must say, I feel a personal stake in this. I've been a vegetarian since 1977. And I must admit that there are a lot of good reasons to be a vegetarian, each one of them in and of itself very convincing. And altogether, I think, unless you're an Alaskan native or live in Siberia, and there's no, you can't access meat. I think there's a health problem. I don't think there's any excuse for eating animal flesh. And my primary reason has always been the welfare of animals. I just think it's morally wrong to cause gratuitous pain to sentient creatures. What I haven't thought enough about, and you've made me think about, and that's the focus of this section, is on the fate of the workers who do this and the cost of it. I'm wondering if you can describe, this is exceedingly unpleasant work, to say the least. And I'm wondering if you can just sort of illustrate it for us.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we talked about inequality, and the theme of the book being that we delegate this work to the least advantaged, not to the powerful and the privileged. Well, let's look at industrial slaughterhouses. And I look in particular at poultry slaughterhouses. It's pretty hard to imagine not just the American food system, not just the American diet. I would almost say the American way of life without the factory farm and the industrial slaughterhouse.
It depends on your American. There are Americans of all different stripes, I think.
Absolutely.
There are vegetarians and vegans, right?
I take your point. I'm not trying to erase that distinction. Okay. I'm merely saying that if we think about how larger structures perpetuate this work, then when we look at an industrial slaughterhouse, we have to think about what it's meeting. why it's there. And what it's meeting is the popular demand in this country for meat that is produced cheaply and distributed very quickly and in abundance to fast food restaurants, cafeterias, etc. So anyway, to get back to the slaughterhouse, you're right. My focus, in some ways, I felt like the literature on the food system and on industrial slaughterhouses, there are really good books about what happens to the animals. Michael Pollan's work, Jonathan Safran Foer's book, Eating Animals. These are accounts that tell you in really vivid detail, what happens to a cow that is sort of brought through the system. I felt we have a lot less on the workers in these slaughterhouses. And as I was saying, the workers in poultry slaughterhouses in particular are predominantly immigrants, many of them undocumented immigrants, people who desperately need paid work, but who are also extremely vulnerable in their social status. If they're working in a place like Texas, which is where one of the poultry slaughterhouses I focus on, you've got a government that is at the time, the Trump administration, conducting raids of slaughterhouses to find undocumented workers. So that's one reason not to speak up. The other reason not to speak up is the fear of being fired if you do. In terms of the experiences of these workers, what's happened in sort of all of the meat industry in the last couple of decades is that the jobs have become increasingly de-skilled. The unions have lost power, and the line speeds in the plants, in the slaughterhouses, go faster and faster. And so what you have is physical injuries, repetitive strain injuries, at just really unconscionable rates. I actually didn't interview a single worker who didn't, I always took the time when we were talking to just, whether we were talking about this or not, I would just say, just let me know, just tell me, what did this do to you physically, this work? And inevitably they would say, oh, my shoulder here, my elbow here, my wrist, I can't do this. I can't, just doing the same repetitive task over and over and over again leads to these astronomically high physical injuries. But it's also an assault on the dignity of these workers because they work in conditions that are so oppressive. And in this poultry slaughterhouse that I focused on in particular, these mostly female undocumented immigrants, Mexican immigrants, the lines were running at such a speed that the supervisors would not allow them to take bathroom breaks. We're in the 21st century, in the wealthiest country in the world. This should not be a reality in our society, that workers cannot take bathroom breaks for fear that they will be fired or reprimanded. And yet this was the reality at this poultry slaughterhouse run by the company Sanderson Farms in Texas.
Yeah, it's absolutely horrendous. I want to get on, I want to segue in a few minutes to the overarching causes of this stratification and economic hierarchy and the possibility of remediation and so forth. But before we do, I want to just, if you can say a word or two, I was quite surprised to see you had a chapter on dirty high-tech work. And I was sort of surprised as to why you included that. And I must, confess personally, I don't have very much sympathy for the dirty high-tech workers. I can feel a great deal of compassion for the Latinos who work at the bottom of the work scale in slaughterhouse. It's absolutely awful. I can feel for Harriet, who is caught in an impossible situation, and even for the drone warrior who's involved in killing other human beings. It's hard to kill a human being emotionally. I can feel for that. I don't have all that. I must admit, Eyal, maybe it's my limitations. I can't muster that much compassion for the moral injury done to the Silicon Valley high-tech worker, even with all the revelations about the social evils of the social networking and Facebook and Twitter and all that business. I can't muster it. So I'm sort of curious as to why you felt the need to include people who look more like us than the other people you were documenting.
Well, I actually think
Right.
I actually think my position is not far from yours. In other words, which is not to make light of in any way to make light of the moral dilemmas of the high tech workers who I write about. I look in particular at two people who worked at Google and who ended up actually leaving their jobs because they felt morally troubled by what they were involved in. They were designing, they were involved in projects that in one case actually helped the military sharpen the imagery on drones. So this was one person who was troubled by that. And then I also tell the story of someone who was troubled by the fact that a Google search engine was going to be designed so that the Chinese government could actually, if certain terms like democracy and human rights came up, those would be blacklisted and taken out, and for obvious reasons was deeply troubled by that. But I actually say in the book, and I conclude, that these workers, as much as they are in an ethically troubling position, they are not dirty workers like the earlier ones we've talked about. And one of the reasons is, in fact, that they left their jobs and were able to leave
That's
their
right.
jobs.
Yes.
Because when you are when you're working at as a software engineer in Silicon Valley, you have a certain amount of social and cultural capital. You probably also have a certain amount of money in your bank account. That doesn't protect you from the fear of losing your job in any way, but it certainly makes it less risky for you to come forward and say, you know what, I don't want to do this. I object to this because you are a skilled, desired worker. You are someone with very widely recognized professional, degrees and skills that you will land on your feet in all likelihood. That's not true of the prison workers I wrote about. It's not true of the slaughterhouse workers I wrote about. It's actually not true of the people in the military that I wrote about. So, I do see it as different. On the other hand, I did feel a need to include it, both in some sense as a counterpoint to the other stories in the book, but also because the second half of the book is about how the things we consume and use have dirty work behind them.
Sure.
And we are right now, I'm talking through a laptop. I will later be on my cell phone. And at the end of that chapter, I do talk about how the global supply chain, to run these machines, we need ion batteries. And ion batteries rely on cobalt. And that cobalt is mined in Africa under very disturbing conditions. And so we end up getting to, although it's outsourced overseas, we end up getting to a very real form of dirty work that lies behind the gadgets.
It's inescapable. And I would argue, I work in the field of human rights, nobody is innocent. You buy your cheap sweater at Target, and it's made in some sweatshop in Bangladesh by oppressed workers. It is virtually inescapable. We all enjoy the privilege of sitting at the top of that chain, indeed, absolutely, and looking down. So, and that's true of the Google worker. I mean, he may have a pang of moral conscience because he's contributing to the arms industry, but he's not going to have to find a job in a poultry factory or in some prison in South Florida. He's got all kinds of options at his fingertips.
No question.
And a lot of money in his bank account, I'm sure, right? Yep. Or in his IRAs or whatever. Anyway, yep. I want to move on. I want to change our conversation and talk about larger causes, which opens up the door to the possibilities of remediation or the lack of it, okay? And here I do want to play a little bit of the devil's advocate, okay? It seems to me that I'm going to make a statement that I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but just to engage you in conversation, that hierarchy is built into the human condition. And the nature of the human being psychologically and so forth is that we we repudiate things that are disgusting. So we enjoy having flush toilets. the creation of sewers and so on to take offal and waste away from us is something that all of us would choose, and so on and so forth. And by analogy, these jobs, as you point out, are geographically out of sight. We don't have to look at them. We don't have to think of them, because in some ways they are morally troubling. And the equivalent would be, in some sense, they disgust us in a way. I mean, that's an overinflated term and so on.
Yeah.
But that's the case. And I'm wondering whether that reality is built into the human condition and in some ways is ineluctable and inescapable. We might be able to mitigate it a little bit and tweak it, but there will always be, one could argue, and I'm not necessarily taking this position, I'm just raising it for the sake of discussion, that in effect, a hierarchy is built into any society and in some ways is inescapable. So that the conditions that you're talking about, as hard as they are, and I have the privilege of being able to talk about it and not having to confront working in these conditions myself, in some ways is ultimately built into the human condition and unavoidable to some degree. I'm raising that as an existential sort of philosophical, sociological question.
Yeah. I think I think there's, it's hard to imagine we don't have a good example of a society without hierarchy in any way. And the experiments that we've had to eliminate it altogether have quickly reproduced it in often horrific form.
Yes, that's correct.
So on that level, I'm with you. What I'm less inclined to say, if we're talking particularly about dirty work, we get to this question, and I've had this question. I've been fortunate since the book has come out to just be doing a lot of media and a lot of interviews, and that's been great to kind of get a conversation going. But some of the folks who have interviewed me have asked me, isn't dirty work inevitable? I mean, doesn't there have to be some of this?
Right.
Can you really imagine a society without it? And I guess what I would say is, to some degree, it probably is inevitable. I cannot point to a society without it. If I did point to such a society, I'd quickly be corrected by someone who knew more about the place than I do, because I'm sure I would be missing, what's happening in the shadows and so forth. But while that's true, it's not inevitable and immutable to have particular kinds of dirty work at the scale and at the level that we have them both today and that even historically in the United States. Let me offer a very simple example. There's a historical section in the book, a very brief historical section, where I talk about the domestic slave trade. This is an abhorrent form of dirty work. It's an abhorrent form of it's an arm. It's what actually perpetuated and enabled slavery to thrive when slaves were no longer imported. It's a form of dirty work that has been eliminated. We don't have it anymore. And there are other examples in the book where that I pass over and talk about that have likewise just passed out of. These are not considered socially acceptable forms of labor. So it's not immutable. And if we go towards the present, to give a more nuanced case, the mental health wards of America's prisons, we do not have to have a society in which jails and prisons are the largest mental health institutions. Right. In fact, that's not the case in many other advanced countries. It was not the case in this country for quite some time. So it's both true that there is an element of human nature that might make us susceptible to these arrangements in some ways. And yet it's not the case. And I would hate to sort of argue that therefore we just throw up our hands and do nothing because it's all kind of set in stone, because it's not.
Right. Okay, very good. You do talk, I mean, I can't read about structural economic inequality without thinking about capitalism and global capitalism, which indeed you you do point to, of course. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of the horrendous wealth gap that we have in this country, which I think is a generator of so much inequality and allows, 40% of the working population to have less than $400 in their bank account. And it probably people whom you document in the slaughterhouses and in the prisons fall into that category. So I'm wondering, to what extent do you see the wealth gap and the nature of our capital system as currently constructed as being very major source of the problems that you're documenting in terms of generating and sustaining dirty work?
I think it's absolutely major, but I think that to the extent my book brings something new to the table in the conversation about inequality, it's not that it's less about wealth inequality and income inequality, though that's implicit in my whole book, case after case, and really, from where dirty work takes place. It takes place in poorer communities and more remote areas, to who ends up doing it. Income and wealth inequality shape those things. But what I'm trying to suggest is that we also have something called moral inequality, that the ability to, in effect, remain aloof from all of this, whether it's drone strikes or prison work or slaughterhouse work, to live one's life removed from all of these unpleasant things, is very easy if you're from a certain social class. Right. And you have a certain set of opportunities. It's much harder if you are more disadvantaged. If you grow up in a town where the main employer at this point is the local jail or prison. So to that extent, the people who end up dirtying their hands versus the people who can go to sleep at night with a very clean conscience, even as this dirty work is being done in their name, what we have there is a moral divide that mirrors and reinforces the economic divide you referred to.
Well, I'm glad you say that, because having worked all my career in the ethical culture movement, I believe that ethics indeed needs to be primary, and that appeals to ethics can indeed be a material motivator in getting people to change their consciousness and hopefully their behavior and their commitments. So I certainly applaud that analysis right on. Let me just ask you a question. We live in very difficult times. I mean, it's a cliche that we live in fraught times. We live in times where people's attitudes, lamentably for many, are fueled by resentment, by anger, by fear. Tribalism, of course, is on the agenda. We're very divided. So I have to ask you, given the concerns that you have that you raised in the book, given that the times we're in, given the structural problems of corporate capitalism, the wealth gap that I'm alluding to, and so on and so forth, and this will be my final question to you: where do you go for hope?
I
always want to end my interviews on a positive note.
Yeah, I will say that one of the most gratifying, I've been fortunate to get a lot of nice reviews of the book, and one of the most gratifying was in the New York Times, and the reviewer, after describing the difficult subject matter of these sort of cases and the moral questions that the book raises, said, that in spite of all this, it is not a cynical book. It is not a book that sort of tones, and it has a sort of tone of resignation or cynicism or hopelessness. And I think that's true. And I think that, although it's not my job to cheer people up, I will say that in each of the cases I look at, whether it's drones or prisons, or for that matter, the food system, the industrial food system, public awareness and public consciousness has changed dramatically on all of those things in the last 10, 15, 20 years, actually in ways I never expected it would. When I started out as a journalist, the first decade or so, I worked as a journalist, and I won't bore people with stories about this, but I was very interested in inequality. Inequality was not a subject that editors were interested in. certainly not at mainstream publications. Mass incarceration was not a subject that editors were interested in. Human rights was not a subject. It was this, sort of 90s moment of we've won the Cold War, we are the model for the rest of the world. What's wrong with us? Nothing. And I think that I take hope from the fact that from polling of younger people to what you see in the media and new publications coming up, we've become much more aware that we are far from a model on all of these fronts. We built the world's largest prison system in this country, and we have to unbuild it. We have fought never-ending wars for 20 years now. We have to ask hard questions about all of that. And I do think that it is in our hands collectively to change things.
Right.
So I do take some hope from that.
That's great. Well, thank you very much. I just want to end with that quote. I saved the review. It's actually very beautiful. And I want to end with this to commend your book. And I do encourage people to read it. It's really a very, very important statement. The reviewer, a Professor Shaw, says, it's a testament to his insight. That's you, Eyal Press. It's a testament to his insight and vision that in spite of the ugliness to which he exposes us on almost every page, he still makes us want to set aside cynicism and pessimism and join him in finding ways to strengthen the moral bonds between us, however flawed we may be. That's a beautiful statement, and I think a very powerful commendation to you and your book. So thank you very much for being with us. And
thank you very much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Well, we do have a few questions, I think, in the chat. So let me turn it over to Melissa and Andrew. If you can send the questions our way, we'll open it up. We'll spend a few minutes with our audience. Yeah, thank you. Okay. Here is a question. First questions from the audience. Okay, here it is. I'll read it. In addition to the real moral outrage that we feel in learning about the problems that Mr. Press addresses in this book, are there any economic, financial, or some other positive incentives for individuals or institutions in tackling these problems? Or do we have to rely on the goodness of activists and advocates to achieve change? That's a beautiful question. We want to know how we can empower ordinary folks, okay, who are not dedicating their lives to remediating these problems, but still want to do something. Right. Thank you for the question. It's a very nice one. Yeah.
So, I do, I think that, we're in this moment. It was fascinating to finish this book as the pandemic was beginning, because what struck me when I was, seeing the newspapers and just reading stories in the news is that there was this conversation for the first time in my lifetime about the division of labor in America. This whole conversation around essential workers. Who are the workers that have the privilege to sit at home? Who are the workers on the front lines of this pandemic who are risking their lives? And it became very obvious quite quickly that this was not fair. This was not equal, right? There were some people, in general, the privileged, who were sitting at home having groceries delivered to them. There were other people on the front lines who were risking their health and their lives. I think we have an opening and an opportunity as a society to start talking about labor and the division of labor in a much more robust way, in a much more, to not just have it be something that we pay attention to when the pandemic happens, but to have it really be central to our politics. So, to that extent, I don't know if I've answered the question, but I think that, advocates maybe start these discussions, but hopefully they become mainstream. They become conversations that different social actors in different arenas can start having.
Yeah, very good. I think the pandemic in some ways did raise our consciousness about so-called essential workers and their role in our lives that were previously hidden or we didn't think about very much. Okay, a second question from one of our viewers. How do poultry slaughterhouses get away with not allowing their employees to use bathrooms? Can't the undocumented workers report their situation to state or federal government agencies? Which raises a larger question about government oversight.
Great question. The second chapter in the slaughterhouse section of the book, by the way, is largely about the occupational safety. It's about the government and about how policies should enable those workers to report things like that, but all too often don't. And I think that unfortunately, we have not taken workplace injuries and the kinds of indignities I described those workers going through sufficiently seriously. If we did, those workers would be able to report without fear. Unfortunately, in the current situation, even with a Democratic administration in power, I don't think there are many slaughterhouses in this country where the immigrant workers would feel safe to speak openly about repressive conditions. There's just too much of a sense they have that they're replaceable, they can be fired. What can they really do? What recourse would they really have? I heard this again and again from these workers, and it's very hard to say they're wrong. So it will take a long time, I think, to change that. We have to have a stronger OSHA. We need stronger unions, and we need more public awareness and public activism around issues of workplace injury and workplace conditions.
Very good. Another question from a viewer: how will the continuing issues of automation and AI affect the existence of dirty jobs in the future?
Great question. I talk about this a little bit in the text section of the book, but I don't see automation eliminating these questions. In other words, we'll just have machines do all of this. Just take the example of drone warfare. We have this phrase unmanned aerial vehicles, which I think leads people to think, the machines are doing the warfare on their own. But as one person in the drone program said to me, quite resentfully, they're not unmanned. They're hypermanned, right? There are sensor operators and imagery analysts and, chaplains and psychologists and commanders and all these people in this kill chain. And so even though one can sort of imagine a brave new world where machines do start carrying out some of the morally troubling tasks we have as a society, I think that the human factor, the element of human design and human input into that is going to remain pretty important. It's not going to take it out of our hands entirely, or I certainly hope it doesn't.
Very good. Well, I think that brings our program to a conclusion. So let me one more time extend my heartfelt gratitude to Eyal Press in terms of bringing to us some very important information based on his research and his marvelous book, Dirty Work. Of course, as you know, I've read it, and I encourage everyone else to read it as well. It's a very, very important document. So thank you very much.
Thank you again, and thank you to the audience. And I will just end on that hopeful note just by saying that, this is a book of stories. And I think that it's at least my hope that although the stories are troubling and ought to be troubling and ought to disturb, there's also places in the book where I think people will find inspiration and see human dignity at its finest, really under challenging conditions. So, to that extent, I think it's not a black and white read. It's a real gray. It's entering the grayness that is our reality.
Absolutely, very well said. One final word, and that is about our next program. We'll be having our next interview on Sunday, November 7th at 4:00, and I'll be interviewing the author Joshua Green on his book entitled Unstoppable, which is a fascinating story about a man who survived Auschwitz and the horrors of the concentration camps to become very successful in American life. So we'll be talking about Unstoppable with Joshua Green on November 7th. Again, Eyal Press, thank you very much. And I wish everybody a very good day. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Right.
Take care.